Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to welcome you all to this space, whether you're in person or virtual, to celebrate Unfurl, Survivals, Sorrows, and Dreaming with Eli Clare. And Eli is in conversation with Suzanne Pharr. And Suzanne has her newish book here with us tonight as well. And these two folks are some of our most favorite writers. And so we're really honored to get to be in the space with both of you. I'm going to tell you just, if you have just stumbled into this room somehow magically, I'm going to tell you a little bit about these folks so that you know where you are and who you're with. Eli Clare is somebody that we have been following for decades now. White, disabled, and genderqueer, Eli Clare lives near Lake Champlain in unceded Abenaki territory, also known as Vermont, where he writes and proudly claims a penchant for rabble-rousing. He has written 2 books of essays, the award-winning Brilliant Imperfection, Grappling with Cure, and Exile and Pride, Disability, Queerness, and Liberation, as well as a collection of poetry, The Morrow's Telling, Words in Motion. His newest book, which we're celebrating tonight, is a mixed genre volume titled Unfurl, Survivals, Sorrows, and Dreaming. He has also been published in dozens of journals and anthologies. He works as a traveling poet, storyteller, and social justice educator. Since 2008, he has spoken, taught, trained, and consulted both in person and remotely at well over 150 conferences and community events and colleges across the United States and Canada. He currently serves on the advisory board for the Disability Project at the Transgender Law Center and is also a Disability Futures Fellow. Among other pursuits, he has walked across the United States for peace, coordinated a rape prevention program, and helped organize the first ever queer disability conference. So welcome, Eli. We're so glad you're here. And Eli is joined in conversation tonight with Suzanne Pharr. Suzanne is a Southern queer feminist and anti-racist organizer. She co-founded the Women's Project in Arkansas in 1981 and was a co-founder of Southerners on New Ground in 1984. She was a director of the Highlander Center from 1999 to 2004, and she is an organizer and political strategist who has spent her adult life working to build broad-based, multiracial, multi-issue movements for social and economic justice in the United States. Since 1980, Pharr has been tracking the growth of a U.S. authoritarian movement and providing political education about its goals, strategies, and leadership. It's not great to be right, is it? Pharr is the author of Homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, which came out in 1988. In the Time of the Right, Reflections on Liberation, which is the very prescient book that came out in 1996, and Transformation Towards a People's Democracy, which came out in 2021. So we're very glad to have you here. We also have some very cool zines that are up front that people can get. And we welcome folks to check those out. So for our online folks, you can ask questions at any time. Just put them in the chat. And for our in-person audience, please, when the time comes, raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone and we'll engage in conversation. But first, we're going to have some readings and some conversation with these two amazing folks. So put your hands together one more time for Eli Clare and Suzanne Pharr.
I am so happy to be here. One big shout out to Charis and to indie bookstores. I would not be the writer I am or the person I am without indie bookstores and without feminist bookstores. And so big shout out to Charis and everyone who made this event happen. Big thank you for all of you, both in person and online, coming out on a Sunday evening to celebrate our two books, celebrate Unfurl and celebrate the second edition of The Time of the Right. And I am so delighted to be sitting here with you, Suzanne. Suzanne has known me since I was 6 months old. Right? We have been in active conversation from the time I was 12 years old. My longest coming out story starts in 1976 with you. And yeah, I'm delighted to have this umpteenth part of the conversation that when we get together, we can never stop talking. Right? So you need to be careful what you're laughing for. I will be doing some timekeeping. It's one of the tasks I've taken on. So I want to, all joking aside, just thank you for being here. I want us to start with something you and I have been talking about since before Trump got elected. The first time I remember being at your house in 2015 talking about the primaries. But the question is, in this time where folks in the US are so polarized, so deeply, deeply, deeply polarized in this time of rising authoritarianism, how do we keep faith? How do we believe? Faith not in a religious sense, but faith in this very secular sense. How do we keep faith? How do we believe in the potential of people changing? Because for anything to change here in the US, people, cultural beliefs, value systems, policies, the way we treat each other, all of those things have to shift. And so where we wanted to start was with this question of how do we maintain this belief in change and transformation, in radicalization. I mean that in a left-wing kind of way, right? I love the word, taking back the word radicalization. That radicalization has so been co-opted by the right to mean very specific things, targeting very specific communities of people, and I love subverting those meanings.
When we were talking this afternoon, it didn't occur to me when you were talking about radicalization. It didn't come into my head about the right taking that word and turning it into a little piece of evil. These are the people to be afraid of. These are the people you should run from. These are the people you should destroy. Because it's a group now, of radicalization. But you have to be radicalized if you believe that to be radical is to go to the root of the problem, the actual meaning of that word, not to be making soft changes up. Sorry for my microphone. I may be in a little bit of battle with this tonight, ER. This is way close. But to to make change, you can't just make the surface change and that be enough. You really do have to go to the root. And that for us, for many of us, I think is a journey. I know a lot of people much younger than I give me the impression sometimes that they were born radical. You know, I've been a radical all my life. I wish I could say that about myself. Not true. You know, I don't think it's true for most people because it takes a certain amount of critical thinking to reach that point that you can get to the bottom of what is the origin of this, and then what is the effect of what that's coming from that origin, and then what is the way that we would be able to change that. And that's where it's the critical thinking that makes us see it, think a passion that we have to change it. You know, that we're at the bottom. If we understand where it comes from and the effect it's having, then we see we cannot stand that effect, so that we have to then be able to make change. And so for me, growing up, I moved from, when you talk about did you know radicals, did you know people who were doing social justice? In the 40s, I did not. I knew more about having Jim Crow out there. I'm going to pause you for 1 second. Just do a little. How's this? There you go. All right. I don't know if I could talk without my hands, but I'm going to try to. Where was I? With Jim Crow. So growing up in the 40s, that's what we were facing. We were facing the war that was against fascism. What did I know about that as a child? I knew only what was around me in my country, farm home, and the community. And so bit by bit, I began to see those things. And then the question is, as you see them, what is the source of that? And over and over and over, we came to it's greed. It's the use of other people's bodies. It's making money off their backs. You know, it moves further and farther through our minds to associate. And then that's how we come to that. The question, though, is how does it happen now? I believe you're asking.
For me, the belief in transformation and radicalization, the root of that belief, the root of knowing it's possible for people to change, is that I was radicalized really fast. It wasn't a moment like you're talking about, it was a process, but the process was actually 3 or 4 years, and my whole world turned upside down, inside out. I grew up in a very right-wing libertarian family in a very conservative part of Oregon. You know, we say Oregon now and we think blue and we think hippie. I grew up in Southern Oregon, which there were hippies, but the hippies were rubbing elbows with right-wing militia. People often talk about Southern racism, and I'm like, well, let me tell you about Southern Oregon racism. Let me tell you about the Grand Dragon of the clan who lived an hour north of where I grew up for a decade. And then I left to go to school, go to college on a full scholarship. And here's where the critical thinking piece is. I met Dykes within 3 weeks of moving to Portland. And I was coming out within that month. And And over the next 4 years, I get with a combination of reading and listening and learning that there were questions to ask that I had never asked before. It was about questioning everything, about learning to question power structures, learning that power structures existed. Part of it was connection, finding community, finding this really deep and vibrant lesbian feminist community. For me, this was almost 2 decades before I had an understanding of myself as trans, and so I came out into lesbian feminist, very politicized community where one of our jobs, I came to know one of our jobs was to encourage people along in this process of radicalization. And so the root of how I know that people can change is I remember changing. I remember this change in myself. I would love to say I've been a lifelong radical, and so not true. So absolutely not true. So the how that radicalization, I think, is about education. There's a reason why fascists all over the world over the last century and a half have hated education. And that's true now, that the rising authoritarians hate education. And part of it's education, part of it is the critical thinking we both named. And for me, part of it was connection, finding people, finding deep belonging with politicized people. And that piece was the longest in coming. Books were such a part of that process. My cultural work, but movement-based cultural work is one of the pieces of the kind of transformation we're talking about, I think.
Becoming radicalized, that having a movement out there provided a lot of that opportunity for critical education. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think of all of the movement spaces of that period of time. This was 1982 to 1985 at the heart of the process, and then but all of the movement spaces, all the journals, all the coffee houses, all the concerts, all the bookstores, all the lesbian feminist institutions that other folks and then I, among other folks, were building. Like we were really building anti-capitalist institutions that we thought they were going to be more durable than they actually were.
Mm-hmm. I think for me and for thousands of other women, part of our radicalization happened in the 70s when the women's movement, was moving hard, moving fast, and they created the first program for women who had been raped. And then after that, we created the first shelters for battered women. And that's where we, I think, got radicalized in terms of authoritarianism. Because you showed me a woman who has experienced domestic violence or violence in any way with men, and I will show you someone who knows what authoritarian is and knows how it functions. But that And the idea that we could actually create something together that would speak to that, because most of us, it had been so silent, so kept within community, but particularly within the home, that people didn't know. I remember my first group where we created a shelter in Arkansas. There were like 8 or 9 of us, and someone had come back from a university in the north, and I think at Rutgers, and said, "There's this thing that you need to know about called battered women," and the language came out of England, and we all were like, "What?" And they were saying, women everywhere are being beaten, raped, not only in the street but in their homes, and it was kept so silent that we were staggered by it. So it was our job to go to the bottom of that and say, what is the source of that? And that's what added the power, I think, to the women's movement.
Yes, yes, yes. And what's true is we, as a cluster of different movements working on different issues, we keep adding layers and tangles and further ways of thinking and talking and educating and rabble-rousing and organizing. I think of the ways in which that really powerful anti-feminist violence didn't know enough about trans people, right?
Almost zero.
Didn't know enough about disabled people, did not know enough about the way that violence and sexist, racist, xenophobic violence impacted immigrants. And that, so this process of radicalization comes in waves and comes in spurts and comes in the continuing education and growth, like what it means now for trans people, particularly trans women and trans femmes, to have access to rape crisis lines and battered women's shelters when they do, because sometimes they don't. What it means to think about ableist violence and sexist violence coming together in the lives of disabled women and disabled non-binary people. What we know now is the numbers in terms of people, disabled people who are surviving sexualized violence is so high, right? So it's like acknowledging these histories and lifting them up, but also acknowledging how we keep filling in the absences, that the radicalization continues for all of us. I think that it's never, even as a process, it's never a one-time process. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely.
And we've said with the utmost respect for the work you're referencing
absolutely.
In the 70s, like utmost respect.
All that you name, you use the word, or the language of crawling a lot in the book. You use the word crawl. It's like we discovered this thing, among people that we knew, because they came into our shelters. But learning about all of the other people and engaging that was like a slow crawl. But that was the critical education, though. And that was movement that took movement to make that happen, to make that crawl get into a different kind of action.
And one of the questions that I'm always asking to figure out where's the next piece that movements need to be pushing against is paying attention to who's not in the room.
Absolutely.
Who's absent. Who's absent and why, and how can we change the social and material conditions that create those absences. So it's not just noticing the absences, it's like doing critical thinking about those absences and then organizing around that analysis. Because part of this is creating connection and building as big and strong communities as we can possibly imagine.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think what it takes in order to see people, we really have to put ourselves by them. You know, it can't be that we read about someone who is different from us. We have to actually be in their presence and be in an engagement with them. And I think that goes to the opening question that you had of how what we do. But it's so easy not to see if you run just with your friends or just with the your white bunch or your queer bunch, and you get so much into it's all about us. Not only not all about us, we are the worst victims of it. It becomes the exaggeration of that as opposed to being there side by side and recognizing that it comes from the same kind of source. That it's not. So I'm going to go move to back to you on that, because I know at some point you're going to read a poem.
Yeah. So I just thought about that poem. In the book, I suggest that part of this is about love, these connections. And I don't mean necessarily romantic love, although I'm not excluding romantic love. And then certainly not writing about love in any way that would ever see a Hallmark card, ever. In this book, I write a lot about love that's fierce, about love that's uncomfortable, about love that asks us to stretch a lot, and love that's not always between humans.
Right.
No, love that's love for everything in this world. I want to insert into this conversation the domination of the earth, that we're living with the consequences of that domination in really vivid ways. And as Suzanne and I were planning this conversation, I said, I think both of us should read something. And Suzanne immediately said, you're going to read two pieces and I'll read one piece. And I said, that was not my first choice, but I was like, I do not want my stubborn rubbing against your stubborn friend. So I'm going, but this book, I describe this book as a queer disabled love song. So I'm going to read one of the love poems in the book that's connected, because it's about this idea of how much we need connection as part of this work of transformation and radicalization, called How to Love for the Long Haul. Remember, love is a muscle the size of our hearts, open hands, wild, open sky. Practice every day. Love fiddleheads, coyotes, white pines. Love red foxes and barn cats, our own round bellies. Love the first ripe cherry tomato, the last bite of pesto, raucous call of crows, and deep quiet of snow. Love bone and gristle, tendon and nerve, each other's tender hearts. Do not succumb to ownership or jealousy. Love through long rain, intense drought. Love in bookstores, in kitchens, alleyways, and traffic jams, at countless protests and pride parades. Love when angry, ashamed, heartbroken, become a sunflower leaning into the sun. What I mean here is this kind of radical, enduring love. And this notion of long haul is another thing we've so talked about. Are you ready to move there, Suzanne? Can I move us to this notion of long haul? So, one of the things I write about in this book is what it's meant to move from epidemic to epidemic, from the AIDS epidemic to the COVID pandemic, move from war to war, move from hurricane to flood to wildfire. And for Suzanne, that's prompted. Well, you can talk about what that's prompted for you, but as we were talking about this, kind of what had felt like endless war and endless epidemic and endless unnatural climate chaos is how do we do this for the long haul? How do we do this for the long haul? What do we need not to become just exhausted and cynical? How do we do this work that's measured not in days and not in weeks and not by semesters and not in years, not even decades, but measured in centuries, all the while holding impatience in one hand because the changes needed to happen yesterday or the day before or a decade ago or a century ago. Hold impatience in one hand and the sense of this is long haul work in the other hand. How do we not become cynical and exhausted beyond the ability to continue pushing?
I mean, we're in a situation where that's so much sorrow is being built, you know, that we're not only stunned by what's happening, but we're we're feeling that sense of, can we make it through? You know, is this going to be too much for us? Because it's enormous, and we, especially the people in this room, we understand how everything's interwoven. You know, it doesn't come as just one event that was originated last year. This comes from decades, you know, centuries of building. So, you know, how do we then fortify ourselves? And I believe that the way we do that is through community. It's through being absolutely connected to other people. But it has to be in the terms that you described when you were talking about the domestic violence movement and the people that were not recognized. It has to be in connection with people who are not just like us, whoever us is. And at the same time, we have to have those very deep relationships. That goes back to when someone was, you know, a child, that you have that wonderful sense of trust. And so it's a question right now of actually building those relationships. But the idea of how we are connected in a time in which most of us are working from Zoom, how we're working in a time in which information is flying at us. How do we bring that into humanness, into our sense of humanity? And how do we bring that into a place? So this is what Eli writes so beautifully about, how it's interconnected with nature, how it's connected with the animal world, how it's interconnected with the spring that flows out of the side of the mountain. How is it connected with all of that? And that, I think, takes us to another place, I believe, in how we think and how we work. The idea of having a multiplicity of people that you are connected to, as well as having your next door neighbor that you're connected to. How do you move into depth at a sense of maintaining your ability to feel? When you have so many things that are negative, how do you maintain that sense of feeling? I don't believe you do it in isolation. I believe you do it in connection. I love the name and the title of this book, Unfurl. And I think that's one of the keys to it, is the idea. And this is your title. I want you to talk about it. But I read this. I read it twice, because it's a book that has so much in it. It's just astounding to me how you could put so much in a book that is so slender, and it's so the information in it has such stark beauty, as well as such firmness of this is the truth of what we see. But Unfurl to me was that sense that you get so down to earth, as we say, that you basically are taking off layers to get to a place of true feeling, a place of honesty, a place of real connection. So you're not living in the wildness of the internet. You're not living in the wildness of knowing that bombs are falling, but you're saying those bombs are falling. This internet is happening. AI is happening. This is happening. This is happening. This is happening. And here we are, connected to one another, working for and with one another, feeling with and for another. That we have this sense that not only unfurl, but when we do that, we come into this. We go from this into that.
So thank you, Suzanne. And part of what made this book possible is that book. I read In the Time of the Right in 1996, just after it was released. And it shaped how I understood capitalism and the religious right and the secular right and the scapegoating that was happening in a democratic presidency. This was the time of Bill Clinton and the rhetoric about welfare queens and how that was code for racist, sexist bullshit. And that this second edition has come out in a time where we so need this primer. It's part defining some social justice terms in really down to earth, complex, but using very accessible language. It's part revealing the brilliant organizing of the right, and it's part lifting the left up. Here's what we can do. Here's what we can do. Here's what we can do. And Unfurl, my book, is in lots of ways made possible by the ways I started understanding the right and understanding the less potential for organizing through connection in that first edition. What else do I want to say about Unfurl? That part of Unfurl, the book for me, is knowing that what I need, what we need, is love in all of these different ways, and multiplicity in all of these different ways among humans and among more than humans, the rocks, the trees, the dirt, the plants, the animals, all of it. It's a multiplicity. And we also need dreaming. I want to add dreaming to the conversation as a strategy. Dreaming liberatory dreams, dreams of the future, dreams of the worlds we want to live in. That dreaming in this moment of rising fascism is not a luxury, is not frivolous, is not a waste of our time. That the dreams are both nourishment and guideposts. Guideposts. Aurora Levins Morales talks about utopian dreaming. The word utopian used to shut us down, shut our desire down over and over again. But she talks about utopian dreams as creating the horizon. And once we know the horizon, we can look at right now and be like, what do we need right now to get to that horizon? And without those dreams, we don't have that horizon. And we need that horizon. I believe that dreaming is a skill we can teach each other and a skill we need to practice together. It's not something that some of us just intuitively have and others of us do not. It's a skill we can actually teach each other. And so many of these ideas come from Black feminists. Like big shout out to Black feminists I'm going to name 3 of dozens of Black feminists. I could name Audre Lorde, Alexis Pulling Gums, Adrienne Maree Brown. I have learned so much of what I'm saying about dreaming from them and others. I am wondering whether you would be up for reading a passage from In the Time of the Right.
So you could tell I'm a much more, I don't know what person compared to that.
I love the spare books. If that's not clear to you, I love the spare books.
I think that you're a poet. I'm a kind of practical gal, I'm afraid. that I'm like, this is the deal, y'all. This is what's going on, and here's what you got to do.
I love the poetry and the practicality side by side. We need both.
That's right.
We
Absolutely.
need both. Talk about multiplicity of organizing and multiplicity of cultural work.
Multiplicity and connection. Well, let's go for 3. Multiplicity, connection, and community. Yeah. All I think are the keys. This is the ending of this book. The last half of the book is sort of moving us toward hope, moving us toward practice, moving us toward what can we do when we see that this thing is organizing out there. We can watch it at that time. This was 1996. And bit by bit, you could kind of put the pieces together. Like, oh, this is happening over there. Oops, this is happening over there. I felt like that was my job, to be an observer and to put those pieces together. So this is the end of the book. We're living in a time of social, cultural, economic, and political conflict in which many values are shifting and being redefined. It is a time of upheaval, change, and fear of loss. Much of the conflict centers around what we believe the U.S. should be: a pluralistic, that is, many ethnicities, many religions, many cultures, democratic society that finds a place and resources for everyone, and I mean everyone. Or what the right envisions: a monocultural, authoritarian society that puts tight limits on people's participation. Should we have a society that uses its resources for the common good? Or a two-tiered society with increased economic stratification and poverty? It is a conflict between the politics of inclusion and sharing and the politics of exclusion and selfishness. It is a time when we must all be particularly vigilant that justice is even-handed, that all rights are equally protected, that there is equal access to education and employment opportunity for everyone, and that we are careful to recognize and work on the complex causes of our social and economic unrest. Avoiding emotional, unexamined nationalism, we need to see ourselves as world citizens and act as responsible stewards of the honored trust to develop and protect democracy and civil liberties. We must caretake and expand the moral ground of justice and equal participation in democracy. As world citizens, which we are, we must find ways to end corporate imperialism and our government's support of human rights abuses when economic gain is at stake. We must hold our governance accountable as a participant in the stewardship of the world's peoples, resources, and environment. A new definition of human rights, which goes beyond that of political torture and abuse. A definition to recognize food, shelter, employment, safety, education, and health must be held up as a standard for people both of this country and of the world. The work before us can be done one step at a time, beginning at the local community level and moving out to the international. Acknowledging the worth and dignity of every individual and developing an understanding of our vital connection to one another and to the natural world, we can create a society where children can be safe and educated and healthy, where people can have decent jobs to enable us to afford housing and and clean, safe neighborhoods where the rights and responsibilities of the individual and the community are balanced, where worldwide the health and well-being of people and the environment are considered the highest goals humans can pursue. Working together, crossing barriers and borders together, we will build a movement that makes real our dream of justice, equality, and freedom.
We're
And what year was that written in? 96. And tonight, here, all of that is still very solid, but we're doing it in a different time. Mm-hmm. And we're all being manipulated in ways we do understand and we don't understand. And so going to nature and getting grounded, I understand. But the community part of it, the engagement part of it, in this time, as an older person, as opposed to younger people who are going to have a chance, they're going to live long enough, I hope, to make a difference. I don't know that I will, and so I'm unclear about how to move forward.
So let me read a poem as a counterpoint to that practicality, which may not be the answer to how we move forward, but maybe creates another kind of space. Does that make sense to this? Let me try to find what I'm looking for. Actually, 116. Pardon me, I did not mark.
Eli taught me a really smart thing today, which is you can take a book like this and get it that with, I don't know, the little wires along here, so it can be open flat, so that you can work. I was so impressed. So I would have thought you would have taught me that. this is Soraya, who is a terrific gift in making this book happen and getting it publicized.
So the question about how is so important. Is so important, and I really believe part of the how is the thing about dreaming. What do we dream? What do we want for the future? Not just how are we going to respond? How are we going to react? How are we going to diffuse the last crisis? How are we going to keep each other alive right now? How are we going to grieve the people we lose right now? Like, all of those things are so real. And there's this growing amount of rage and sorrow. Mm-hmm. And so part of the how is about dreaming. And part of dreaming is not just about the future, but also about the past. And I'm going to read this poem as really as the poetic counterpart to what you just read. But we two-stepping through time. Remember, before the first whaling ships leave port and after the last oil wells run dry. Remember, we picking the locks, flinging the doors open. Remember, we renovating 2-car garages into apothecaries, goats in the front yard, chickens running free. Remember, before the existence of ownership, after the abolishing of money. Remember, we turning golf courses into vegetable gardens. Remember, we tending the soil. Ninth hole, a tangle of tomatoes and squash in late August. Remember, because forgetting is as dangerous as shame. And I'm haunted by the question of how. I wish there were discrete answers right now. I wish there were discrete answers. I don't think any one of us has specific answers. I think the response to the how is going to be layer after layer after layer in a very communal way.
And also it's the piece that you see before you that you know you might be able to help. For example, I know that you love books. I know that about you. And Lord help us, our libraries. I mean, there's something every day that we can do in relation to saving those. That's why the likes of you and me who adore books, and I imagine just about everybody in this room, it's our place to work by, challenging the people who are in charge of those, challenging who's taking the money away, challenging.
Challenging censorship.
Absolutely. Challenging censorship of what's happening in terms of the news. I mean, but wherever it is, where you are, to take on that piece, and you can take if you take on the library, you're already moving into the multiplicity that we're talking about, because that's what we're fighting for. We're like, yes, you will have those books there. You will not deny this group of people the books about their lives, their history, and you won't deny us their lives and their history. How will we ever know one another if we don't have some vehicle for passing that on?
So are we ready to open this up? Some of us think of this next part of an event as a question and answer Q&A, but that assumes that you all have questions and that Suzanne and I have answers, and if there's anything I know that's not exactly true. Not exactly true. No offense, Suzanne.
I bet y'all have some reflection.
Yeah, reflection. I'd like to think of this as community conversation, as times for rants and raves and opinions and soapboxes and bewilderments and questions and answers.
I love that. All right, Sam, I saw your hand.
Thank you both, and especially for the questions, because I think they're very much in high focus right now for many of us, and have been. Obviously, thank you for the 1990s and what we were all facing then. But one of the things that struck me in this discussion this morning, or this right now, is also the right and so many of the forces that are ascendant right now seem to be coming out of community. And I say that in the sense that, I'm thinking about toxic masculinity or the fear behind letting go of control, or letting go of the environment or the people, the churches, the synagogue, anybody who you are in community with in a very deep way. And to go against that, to lose, I think about the journey we've all been on, and sometimes the losses that have happened, either with family or with community, by becoming ourselves. I think sometimes, that some of the people we think of as enemies or coming after us are functioning so much out of fear and a very primal fear of losing their community. So I just bring that up as something I think about, that sometimes seeing difference feels like a threat. So I just wondered what you thought about that, or just to put it out there as a point of conversation. And it's a very hard thing to actually fight, even though we are in our own communities and find great solace in them. But sometimes it just doesn't get through, especially in the face of fear and the fear of losing family or community.
Do you want to speak to that?
I think part of it is organizing around the material conditions in people's lives. Because there's a way in which the world as it exists right now is not serving the material conditions for a lot of the people who voted for Trump. Mm-hmm. Right? A lot of us say that, but what does it mean to organize around that? What is it to organize around belonging that includes enough food and enough shelter, and enough education, and enough clean air, and enough clean water? And this planet has enough for all of us. Even with as much plundering as we as humans have done, this planet of ours has enough for all of us. If we organize our relationships to the planet and each other in different ways. And so what you're saying about people being afraid to lose community is really true. And yet some of those communities' material needs are not being met. And not being met in really desperate ways. And how do we begin to organize in ways to meet those unmet material needs? Do and educate in ways, connect in ways that say your material needs can be met. We live in a world where there does not need to be scarcity. If there are no longer billionaires, let us dream of the world of what's possible if there are no longer billionaires, right? So I think it's a question of organizing. How do we organize? How do we do that long haul work of organizing where some of the communities of belonging are belonging without the material needs being met?
It's probably a good companion to that is one of my favorite signs I saw yesterday, or a t-shirt somebody was wearing, was I'm radicalized by common decency. And I think the language we use in trying to make those bridges and trying to dream in a way that includes the right or people on that side of trying trying to dream how we coexist is hard. It's hard for me to open my heart to that and try to imagine how that can work. But I'm also thinking about the power of these words. Like when we say radicalized, I imagine a wall for them. And I'm wondering about reclaiming words like, reclaiming empathy as a common value, but also I kind of like the word redemption for them. I think, as imagining them coming to our side in some way or enough to meet common ground. Post Reconstruction, it's like they're sort of a failure, and we have to sort of imagine, how do we do this time in a way that has sustainability?
I think some of it is organizing around small things. When you're talking, move that just a little bit. I have an Irish nose that I just can't get quite quite as close to this as I should. I feel like we have three things we have to do right now. That we have to resist the attack on things like our libraries. That's an act of resistance, because the libraries are already working and building in the way that we had hoped they would, and they're expanding, and what they're doing with people. I love our library in Little Rock, where we can go once a month and get anything repaired that we have around the house. I mean, what a wonderful thing, for people not to have to pay for that. They could go and get it repaired there. So libraries are already doing that. So it's resisting the attack on them. Like, how dare you do that? So that's one piece that we just have to do. And then we also have to build ourselves. That we have to create the things that meet those material needs through that lens that says the material needs of everybody. So I think as things are being taken away from people right now, that's the place to organize. I thought as soon as they mentioned that they would take away first USA, that the idea that we would take that away from other countries seemed to me exactly the place that we should be organizing, that would say clearly that we're in total relationship with other countries. We care about them as we care about ourselves. So that would be a great place. And then to go for people's health care. Here's another one where if you cannot afford health care, you're going to need Medicaid. So we should be, I think, organizing around that. That's a place of resistance. And then our idea should be to build that out. So that's possible for far more people than get it now. Don't have such limitations on it, to make it that multiplicity that you were talking about. And then SNAP, the very idea that we would let our children starve, the very idea that we should sit back and say, well, those damn folks, they're doing that. Still to say, no, we organize to stop that. And not only while we're stopping it, we're going to produce as much food as we possibly can. So just to say stop is not enough. It's like, can you then put something in that place? And I think it starts here. Most of us like to think, myself, let's stop this mess up here, because it's so enormous and so terrible, and the pain is so great in it. But if we're not doing it right here at the same time, I think we lose the link from here to there, and that, I think, is critical, that link stay alive, so that we are connected to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is connected to us and our little world that's here. And how do we shift that to be something rather than these divided blocks of people that you're talking about?
It makes me think of something you write about in your book, about one of the strategies that the right was very intentionally taking over library boards and school boards and city councils. So really, really local politics. But the right really stacking those local bodies of power and building upon that. And it makes me think about learning from that strategy. You know, building on what's being organizing around what's being taken away from us collectively, us who are not billionaires, basically. And one of those places is let's start stacking school boards and library boards and city councils. So this notion of local and global, you know, local organizing, local, but trickle up, not trickle down.
Right.
This is your obligatory reminder that November 4th is an election day here and around the country, wherever you're watching. And here in Georgia, in Atlanta in particular, we have the Public Service Commissioner elections, which have been denied. We haven't been able to vote on that for 6 years because of gerrymandering, basically. So it's a big deal, and there are two good candidates that you can vote for. You get 2 votes, so that's an important race. In the city of Atlanta, you get to vote for the mayor, which is important. I wish there was somebody exciting to vote for, but you do get to participate in that. There's also the city council chair, as well as other positions on the city council. That's a very important race. In school board elections. So these are really, really important municipal races, and they often are very under participated in. So if you know, and also look at your county races, because there's judges. We know judges make such a huge difference because Trump got all his federal judges from these smaller courts, and now they're, you know, running up the clock on a lot of stuff. So definitely participate if you can on November 4th.
Yes. And I want to acknowledge all of us that feel cynical as hell about voting, and there are like really, really, really valid reasons for feeling really cynical about voting. And whether we feel cynical about voting or not, we know that the work doesn't start with voting and doesn't end with voting either.
Yes, and y'all are 2 great examples of that. There's so many ways to participate and so many ways to share your wisdom and your knowledge. And so I'm very grateful to y'all for being here tonight. Thank you to everybody who's with us. For our online folks, you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Unfurl as well as Suzanne's books. And for folks who are here, you can get first dibs on signed books. And we'd love for you to hang out and chat with these folks and get your books signed, and meet each other if you haven't, because one of the ways that you can fight all of this is to build community and meet people that you haven't met. So can we get one more round of applause?
Thank you.
And y'all will just